Coming up. And if you're a Democrat and you wonder how this happened, ask yourself whether you really should believe that the Obama presidency was a success. I don't think it was, and even as millions of Democrats tell themselves that he was a tremendous president, they really should ask themselves where he left their party. The answer isn't pretty. The penalties from failure can last a long time. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Let's talk about the fact that things just have a tendency of coming back around, of coming back to bite you. The penalties for significant mistakes, significant failures, public missteps are rarely served only in the immediate aftermath of the mistake, failure, or misstep. Let's take the mistakes of the Obama administration. You can argue about how bad they were. He was, after all, beloved on much of the world stage, virtually worshipped by the news media, seen by large numbers of youth as the epitome of cool, and was certainly viewed in an extremely positive light by the bulk of the Democrat Party. And he did, after all, get reelected. So why am I referencing his administration as an example of failure? Because Barack Obama's administration was an overwhelming electoral failure for Democrats. The numbers are startling. Democrats went from controlling both chambers of 27 state legislatures in 2009 to controlling both chambers in only 13 of them 8 years later. The Democrats also lost 13 governorships and 816 state legislative seats. At the federal level, they lost 12 Senate seats and 64 House seats. By 2016, on a nationwide level, the GOP was the strongest it's been since 1928, measuring at the presidential, congressional, state legislative, and governorship level. You can check multiple articles for backup on this, including the Real Clear Politics article by Sean Trend on November 17, 2016, entitled Republican Party the Strongest It's Been in 80 Years. So I'm referring to those electoral failures of the Democratic Party when I talk about penalties suffered from failures not all being felt in the immediate aftermath of the failure. So what do I mean? What are the penalties felt later? Have you ever wondered how the Democratic Party ended up in a situation where its presidential slate is so weak and, frankly, old? The primary contenders for the Democrat presidential nomination are shockingly old. Joe Biden is 77. Elizabeth Warren is a comparative youngster at 70. Bernie Sanders is 78 years old and recently had a heart attack. Yeah, you say, but Pete Buttigieg is only 38. Yeah, and he's also horribly underqualified. As I've said before, you don't go directly from being mayor of a town of 102,000 people to being the president of a country of over 330 million people with the world's largest economy and the world's most powerful military. That just doesn't happen. So how did the Democrats end up in this situation? Well, lots of people, including me, have pointed to their out-of-control move to the left. They're out of sync with the rest of the country. They've moved far to the left. So far, any candidate that truly qualifies as a moderate is rejected outright, except that potentially they can survive in the primary if they endorse virtually every far-left position. And that does explain, to some extent, how they ended up in this situation with a uniquely unimpressive and aged field. But that only explains it partially. The other factor, and frankly, I think it's the biggest factor, is that they lost their farm system. They lost their minor league. Anybody that follows baseball, and frankly, many that don't, know about the baseball farm system. The minor leagues of professional teams spread out across the country. Those minor league baseball teams prepare players for the show, for the majors. They iron out the kinks in their swings, help them perfect their fielding. They put pitchers up against progressively better hitters as they move their way up from the lowest levels to AAA until the best players make it to the show, the major league. In America, the minor leagues of politics are the lower levels of government, starting at the local level, then working up through the state level until finally reaching the federal level, Congress and the presidency, the show, the major league. And what happened with those minor league players at the state level in the Democratic Party? The ones that were trying to work their way up through to AAA and then make that leap to the federal level to the show? They lost. They lost during the Obama years. They weren't there in the governorships. They weren't there in the state legislatures prepping for that congressional or Senate run. The stars that could have been never were. We don't know about them. We never saw them. We never thought about them. And when those Democrat presidential debates rolled around every few weeks of this election cycle, those stars who were supposed to work their way up through the minor leagues weren't there. Instead, the Democrats were left with some incredibly aged stars struggling to stay in the lineup, and one single-A competitor from the South Bend franchise trying to skip straight over AA and AAA to get his ticket to the show. It's not going to happen. And if you're a Democrat and you wonder how this happened, ask yourself whether you really should believe that the Obama presidency was a success. I don't think it was. And even as millions of Democrats tell themselves that he was a tremendous president, they really should ask themselves where he left their party. The answer isn't pretty. The penalties from failure can last a long time. Next topic. Failure is contagious. The coronavirus outbreak is reason for serious concern. It could become a pandemic. The death rates in the most advanced countries like the United States will likely be nowhere near as high as those in China, but they could become a serious threat, like a very bad flu outbreak. Because the virus is so contagious, it could have a severe economic impact as residents avoid going out in public and therefore avoid eating in restaurants or flying or going to the movies or going to the mall. The economic impact would be massive, and we've already seen the impact on the stock market, and it hasn't been pretty. You know what else hasn't been pretty? The attempts by Democrats to pin blame for the virus spread on President Trump. Even after 3 years of over-the-top attacks on the president by most of the media, Democrat Party leadership, huge numbers of rank-and-file Democrats, and the left-wing Twitter brigade, for a brief moment, I held out hope that the country would come together and play it straight, recognizing that we face a serious challenge and we have to work hand in hand. That hope lasted only a moment, and then Democrat leadership went on the attack. Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi attacked the president relentlessly, with Schumer criticizing him as showing, quote, towering and dangerous incompetence, close quote, and his response to the virus as inadequate. Nancy Pelosi referred to the president's virus response as shameful and anemic. The president struck back, describing Nancy Pelosi as incompetent and criticizing Democrat leadership for politicizing the outbreak and failing to work together for the good of the country. If you've been listening to this podcast for very long, you know that I expect President Trump to win re-election and that I expect his electoral margin to be larger than in 2016. But each time I've made that prediction, I've inserted a caveat. That caveat is, provided the economy doesn't tank. And if it does, all bets are off. As I've noted before, by saying all bets are off, I'm not saying that President Trump would lose if the economy tanks. I'm simply saying that my prior predictions would no longer control. In that event, it might be more like a toss-up. But maybe not. Maybe with an event like a pandemic tanking the stock market, it would be harder for the public to blame President Trump. Sure, there are things for the Democrats to attack, including prior proposed budget cuts from the president with regard to the CDC, but the cuts were never made. Funding is higher now than when President Trump took office. John Bolton under President Trump did reorganize the bloated NSC, and some of those changes impacted teams assigned to pandemic response, so there have been things the Democrat leadership could point to when they want to attack the administration's virus response effort, but I don't think it's been very effective. One of the reasons it hasn't been very effective is that President Trump early on chose to restrict travel from China. That prompted an adverse reaction from China, public comments from former World Health Organization reps describing the action as premature, attacks from some on the left saying it was motivated by racism, and criticism from Chuck Schumer himself. I'm sure Schumer wishes he could take back that criticism. But the other reason that the attacks haven't been effective is that the public is consciously or subconsciously making a leadership comparison when the attacks come from Pelosi and Schumer. Notwithstanding the fact that Nancy Pelosi may be the single most repellent politician on the face of the earth, at least in the past there used to be a sense that she was politically astute and that she knew how to lead the Democrats in her chamber. There used to be a sense also that as annoying as Chuck Schumer could be, at least he wasn't Nancy Pelosi. But that's changed. Why has it changed? Because of failure. Because of the impeachment of Donald Trump. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer failed, and they failed miserably. Donald Trump emerged from the impeachment acquitted, vindicated, victorious, and Pelosi and Schumer were left claiming that an acquittal isn't an acquittal because they didn't get the Senate-level witnesses they requested, after claiming that the case had already been proven, describing it as infallible, which is, of course, in complete conflict with the request for additional witnesses. But when the public looks to the impeachment, what they see is a Democratic loss. And when the public looks to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer describing the president as incompetent and the virus response as anemic, they ask themselves whether they'd want Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer in charge of that response instead. And the answer they give to themselves is predominantly, no, not really. Those who despise President Trump want him out. And as to virus response or any presidential responsibility, they want anyone other than President Trump. But for everyone else, including most importantly uncommitted independents, the idea of Pelosi or Schumer in that position is a lot less attractive now than it was before the impeachment failure. As noted in the prior segment, the penalties for failure last long after the event. Next topic. Campus lunacy. It's been a while since I highlighted an instance of what really should be referred to as campus lunacy, the behavior and positions of college students that are so outside the norms of reasonable adult behavior that it leaves lunacy as not too strong a word. This particular instance involves the most absurd of left-wing tropes, cultural appropriation. In this instance, the breach was white people singing African-American spirituals. The Western Michigan University Choir performed a show entitled Spirituals from Ship to Shore. Frankly, it sounds like something I'd like to see and hear. I love college music performances, and few things are quite as moving as a spiritual. In this instance, the music professor who put the performance together was African American. To the consternation of a student in the audience, much of the choir was white. In her words, quote, So apparently Western Michigan University thinks it's okay for white peoples to sing Negro spirituals while the instructor talking about, quote, these songs don't belong to one race, close quote. They sure as hell do, close quote. Incidentally, in her words, the term white and the term do were in all caps, which is the reason why I pronounced them as I did. It's hard for me to express how absurd I find the concept of cultural appropriation. The fact that the concept exists is evidence of just how crazy left-wing views have become. African Americans have justifiably complained for more than 100 years about being marginalized in society. But the view of the left that their cultural contributions can only be practiced and enjoyed by African Americans themselves is in and of itself a form of marginalization. Does anybody claim that only those of Italian descent can enjoy a serving of lasagna? Can only those of Mexican ancestry order a taco? I've lost track of the number of times I've ordered vegetables from Pashal's restaurant in the Atlanta airport. They're salty, thoroughly cooked in the Southern tradition, and qualify as and are proudly referred to as soul food. The restaurant is the airport outpost of the legendary Pashal's restaurant in Atlanta, founded by James Pashal, whose business figured prominently in Atlanta politics and the civil rights movement. Was I committing cultural appropriation by ordering black-eyed peas and collard greens? Frankly, I don't care. The very concept is absurd. Every piece of American culture is part of what we are. The idea that I can't order chicken and waffles or listen to B.B. King because I'm white is as ridiculous as saying that someone who's black can't listen to Frank Sinatra or order Stromboli. So how did the school respond to the student's complaint? Quote, as a member of the audience, a student in attendance was concerned about what she experienced. She made those concerns known on social media and sent an email to WMU leadership. We take the students' concerns very seriously, close quote. The African-American music professor who put the show together was visiting from Maryland, and he had a comment as well. He was surprised by the complaint. Quote, I have only been experiencing people who come up to me and ask to hug me and say that they're thrilled to have the experience. Kalamazoo is majority white, right? So I don't know how else to respond to that, close quote. Now there you have a mature, rational response to the complaint, as opposed to the university's response, which was a non-response and avoided labeling the complaint for what it was, ridiculous. And what was that complaint? It was a failure, another example of far-left absurdity. The vast majority of Americans understand the beauty of spirituals and understand that every American has a right to sing them and to enjoy them, just as every American celebrates every year the greatness of the African-American reverend who helped bring us together in recognition of the need for serious civil rights reforms. Would anybody suggest that somehow only African Americans can celebrate Martin Luther King Day? Such a suggestion would be every bit as absurd as suggesting that white students can't sing a spiritual. And with every one of these instances of absurdity, the left is failing. And the penalties for failing are felt long after the instance of failure. I sense that things are coming around. The culture is going to rebound. Generation Z, those born between 1997 and 2012, are remarkably more conservative than prior generations. And the impact of that conservatism is going to be felt for a very long time. In the next 10 to 15 years, I predict the instances of campus lunacy are going to become progressively more rare, to the benefit of us all. Next topic. South Carolina firewall. This will be a quick one. Joe Biden has more campaigning left in him. His candidacy is still alive. The South Carolina firewall held, with Biden bringing in nearly 50% of the Democrat primary vote, and Bernie Sanders far behind at less than 20%. For Tom Steyer, third place wasn't good enough, and as I predicted over a week ago, he dropped out of the race. Next up is Super Tuesday, so Biden will have less than 3 days to bask in the glory of an overwhelming South Carolina win before entering a race with only a single state, Alabama, that mimics South Carolina demographically. Still, the resounding win will help Biden in other states as well. His problem, though, is money. Bernie Sanders is flush with it, and Biden is far from it. We'll see what happens, but the Biden win does increase the likelihood that no candidate will enter the Democrat convention with more than 50% of the vote. That means the likelihood of the decision being made by the superdelegates rises dramatically, and with it the odds of a contentious split between Bernie supporters and the rest of the party. The Democrats can't be looking forward to it. But you know who would look forward to that kind of a contested convention? The media, and cable news especially. And you know what? Your humble podcaster will enjoy watching it too and talking about it. And the next time I'll be talking about political issues will be next week. I can't wait, and I hope you can't wait either. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. As I mentioned last week, the Political Spirits website is up and running. You'll find it at political-spirits.com. Once again, political-spirits.com. You'll find graphic cover pages for each new episode, running about 1 week behind the regular podcast you find from me at Libsyn and on Apple Podcasts and other podcast sites. My bio is on the new website as well. There are links to world news stories of interest and related articles, and a discussion forum is coming soon. Incidentally, you'll also find the 11 maxims of Political Spirits. Be sure to subscribe to my website. There's a lot of content, and we're on Instagram now as well at Political Spirits. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube also, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.